Section 1 of the American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. Cinderella's Slippers by Hugh C. Ware. Part 1. 1. Raymond Rennick might have been going to his wedding instead of to his death. Spick and span in a new spring suit, he paused just outside the broad-arched gates of the Duffield estate and drew his silver cigarette case from his pocket. A self-satisfied smile flashed across his face as he struck a match and inhaled the fragrant odor of the tobacco. It was good tobacco, very good tobacco, and Senator Duffield's private secretary was something of a judge. For a moment Rennick lingered. It was a day to banish uncomfortable thoughts, to smooth the rough edges of a man's problems and burdens. As the secretary glanced up at the soft blue sky, the reflection swept his mind that his own future was as free from clouds. It was a pleasing reflection. Perhaps the cigarette, perhaps the day helped to deepen it, as he swung almost jauntily up the winding driveway towards the square white house, commanding the terraced lawn beyond. Just ahead of him a maple tree, standing alone, rustled gaily in its spring foliage like a woman calling attention to her new finery. It was all so fresh and beautiful and innocent. Rennick felt a tingling thrill in his blood. Unconsciously he tossed away his cigarette. He reached the rustling maple and passed it. From behind the gnarled trunk a shadow darted. A figure sprang at his shoulders, with the long blade of a dagger awkwardly poised. There was a flash of steel in the sunlight. It was perhaps 10 minutes later that they found him. He had fallen face downward at the edge of the driveway, with his body half across the velvet green of the grass. A thin thread of red, creeping from the wound in his breast, was losing itself in the sod. One hand was doubled, as in a desperate effort at defence. His glasses were twisted under his shoulders. Death must have been nearly instantaneous. The dagger had reached his heart at the first thrust. One might have fancied an expression of overpowering amazement in the staring eyes. That was all. The weapon had caught him squarely on the left side. He had evidently whirled toward the assassin almost at the instant of the blow. Whether in the second left him of life he had recognized his assailant, and the recognition had made his death blow the quicker and the surer, were questions that only deepened the horror of the noonday crime. As though to emphasize the hour, the mahogany clock in Senator Duffield's library rang out its 12 monotonous chimes as John Dorrance, his valet, beat sharply on the door. The echo of the nervous tattoo was lost in an unanswering silence. Dorrance repeated his knock before he brought an impatient response from beyond the panels. "Can you come, sir?" The valet burst out. "Something awful has happened, sir. It's... The door was flung open. A ruddy-faced man with thick white hair and grizzled moustache, and the hints of a nervous temperament showing in his eyes and voice, sprang into the hall. Somebody once remarked that Senator Duffield was Mark Twain's double. The senator took the comparison as a compliment, perhaps because it was a woman who made it. Dorrance seized his master by the sleeve, which loss of dignity did more to impress the senator with the gravity of the situation than all of the servant's excitable words. "Mr. Rennick, sir, has been stabbed, sir, on the lawn, and Miss Beth, sir." Senator Duffield staggered against the wall. The valet's alarm swerved to another channel. "Shall I get the brandy, sir?" "Brandy?" the senator repeated vaguely. The next instant, as though grasping the situation anew, he sprang down the hall, with the skirts of his frock coat flapping against his knees. At the door of the veranda he whirled. "Get the doctor on the phone, Dorrance. Redfield, if Scott is out, let him know it's a matter of minutes. And, Dorrance—" "Yes, sir." "Tell the telephone girl that, If this leaks to the newspapers, I will have the whole office discharged." A shifting group on the edge of the lawn, with that strange sense of awkwardness which sudden death brings, showed the scene of the tragedy. The circle fell back as the senator's figure appeared. On the grass, Rennick's body still lay where it had fallen, suggesting a skater who has ignominiously collapsed on the ice rather than a man stabbed to the heart. The group had been wondering at the fact in whispered monosyllables. A kneeling girl was bending over the secretary's body. It was not until Senator Duffield had spoken her name twice that she glanced up. In her eyes was a grief so wild that for a moment he was held dumb. "Come, Beth," he said gently, "this is no place for you." At once the white-faced girl became the central figure of the situation. If she heard him, she gave no sign. The senator caught her shoulder and pushed her slowly away. One of the woman servants took her arm. Curiously enough, the two were the only members of the family that had been called to the scene. The senator swung on the group with a return of his aggressiveness. "Someone who can talk fast and to the point, tell me the story. Burke, you have a ready tongue. How did it happen?" The groom, a much-tanned young fellow in his early 20s, touched his cap. "I don't know, sir. No one knows. Mr. Rennick was lying here, stabbed, when we found him. He was already dead." "But surely there was some cry, some sound of a scuffle?" The groom shook his head. "If there was, sir, none of us heard it. We all like Mr. Rennick, sir. I would have gone through fire and water if he needed my help. If there had been an outcry loud enough to reach the stable, I would have been there on the jump." "Do you mean to tell me that Rennick could have been struck down in the midst of 15 or 20 people with no one the wiser? It's ridiculous, impossible." Burke squared his shoulders with an almost unconscious suggestion of dignity. "I'm telling you the truth, sir." The senator's glance dropped to his secretary's body, and he looked up with a shudder. Then, as though with an effort, his eyes returned to the huddled form, and he stood staring down at the dead man, with a frown knitting his brow. Once he jerked his head toward the gardener with a curt question. "Who found him?" Jenkins shambled forward uneasily. "I did, sir. I hope you don't think I disturbed the body." The senator shrugged his shoulder impatiently. He did not raise his head again until the sound of a motor in the driveway woke the attention. The surgeon had arrived. Almost at the same time there was a cry from Jenkins. The gardener stood perhaps a half a dozen yards from the body, staring at an object hidden in the grass at his feet. He stooped and raised it. It was a woman's slipper. As a turn of his head showed him the eyes of the group turned in his direction, he walked across to Senator Duffield, holding his find at arm's length, as though its dainty outlines might conceal an added nest. The slipper was of black suede, high-heeled and slender, tied with a broad black ribbon. One end of the ribbon was broken and stained as though it had tripped its owner. On the thin sole were cakes of the peculiar red clay of the driveway. It might have been unconscious magnetism that caused the senator suddenly to turn his eyes in the direction of his daughter. She was swaying on the arm of the servant. Throwing off the support of the woman, she took 2 quick steps forward, with her hand flung out as though to tear the slipper from him. And then, without a word, she fell prone on the grass. 2. The telephone in my room must have been jangling a full moment before I struggled out of my sleep and raised myself to my elbow. It was with a feeling of distinct rebellion that I slipped into my kimono and slippers and shuffled across to the sputtering instrument in the corner. From 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening I had been on racking duty in the Farragut poison trial, and the belated report of the wrangling jury, at an hour which made any sort of meal impossible until after 10, had left me worn out physically and mentally. I glanced at my watch as I snapped the receiver to my ear. It lacked barely 15 minutes of midnight, an unearthly hour to call a woman out of bed, even if she is past the age of sentimental dreams. "Well?" I growled. A laugh answered me at the other end of the wire. I would have slung the receiver back to the hook and myself back to bed had I not recognized the tones. There is only one person in the world, excepting the tyrant at our city editor's desk, who would arouse me at midnight. But I had thought this person separated from me by 1,200 miles of ocean. "Madeline Mac!" I gasped. The laughter ceased. "Madeline Mac it is," came back the answer, now reduced to a tone of decorous gravity. "Pardon my merriment, Nora, the mental picture of your huddled form." "But I thought you in Jamaica," I broke in, now thoroughly awake. "I was, until Saturday. Our steamer came out of quarantine at 4 o'clock this afternoon. As it develops, I reached here at the psychological moment." I kicked a rocker to my side and dropped into it with a rueful glance at the rumpled sheets of the bed. With Madeline Mac at the telephone at midnight, only one conclusion was possible, and such a conclusion shattered all thoughts of sleep. "Have you read the evening dispatches from Boston, Nora?" "I have read nothing, except the report of the Farragut jury," I returned crisply. "Why?" "If you had, you would perhaps divine the reason of my call. I have been retained in the Rennick murder case. I am taking the 1:30 sleeper for Boston. I secured our berths just before I telephoned." "Our berths?" "I am taking you with me. Now that you are up, you may as well dress and ring for a taxicab. I will meet you at the Roanoke Hotel." "But," I protested, "don't you think—" "Very well, if you don't care to go, that settles it." "Oh, I will be there," I said with an air of resignation. 10 minutes to dress and 15 minutes for the taxi." "I will add 5 minutes for incidentals," Madeline replied, and hung up the receiver. The elevator boy at the Occident, where I had my modest apartment, had become accustomed to the strange hours and strange visitors of a newspaper woman during my 3 years' residence. He opened the door with a grin of sympathy as the car reached my floor. As though to give more active expression to his feelings, he caught up my bag and gave it place of honor on his own stool. "Going far?" he queried as I alighted at the main corridor. "I may be back in 24 hours, and I may not be back for 24 days," I answered cautiously. I knew Madeline Mac. As I waited for the whir of the taxicab, I appropriated the evening paper on the night clerk's desk. The Rennick murder case had been given a 3-column head on the front page. If I had not been so absorbed in the Farragut trial, it could not have escaped me. I had not finished the headlines, however, when the taxi, with a promptness almost uncanny, rumbled up to the curb. I threw myself back against the cushions, switched on the electric light, and spread my paper over my knee, as the chauffeur turned off towards Fifth Avenue. The story was well written and had made much of a few facts. Trust my newspaper instinct to know that. I had expected a fantastic puzzle, when it could spur Madeline into action within 6 hours after her landing, but I was hardly anticipating a problem such as I could read between rather than in the lines of type before me. Long before the Roanoke loomed into view, I had forgotten my lost sleep. The identity of Raymond Rennick's assassin was as baffling as in the first moments of the discovery of the tragedy. There had been no arrests, nor hint of any. From the moment when the secretary had turned into the gate of the Duffield yard until the finding of his body, all trace of his movements had been lost as effectually as though the darkness of midnight had enveloped him instead of the sunlight of moon. More than 10 minutes could not have elapsed between his entrance into the grounds and the discovery of his murder, perhaps not more than 5, but they had been sufficient for the assassin to effect a complete escape. There was not even the shadow of a motive. Raymond Rennick was one of those few men who seem to be without an enemy. In an official capacity, his conduct was without a blemish. In a social capacity, he was admittedly one of the most popular men in Brookline, among both sexes. Rumor had it, apparently on unquestioned authority, that the announcement of his engagement to Beth Duffield was to have been an event of the early summer. This fact was in my mind as I stared out into the darkness. On a sudden impulse I opened the paper again. From an inside page the latest photograph of the senator's daughter taken at the fashionable Boston studio, smiled up at me. It was an excellent likeness as I remembered her at the inaugural ball the year before, a wisp of a girl, with a mass of black hair, which served to emphasize her frailness. I studied the picture with a frown. There was a sense of familiarity in its outlines which certainly our casual meeting could not explain. Then, abruptly, my thoughts flashed back to the crowded courtroom of the afternoon, and I remembered. In the prisoner's dock I saw again the figure of Beatrice Farragut, slender, fragile, her white face, her sombre gown, her eyes fixed like those of a frightened lamb on the jury which was to give her life or death. She poisoned her husband, had Buster whispered comments at my shoulders during the weary weeks of the trial. She couldn't harm a butterfly. Like a mocking echo, the tones of the foreman had sounded the answering verdict of murder in the first degree. And in New York this meant... Why had Beatrice Farragut suggested Beth Duffield? Or was it Beth Duffield who had suggested... I crumpled the paper into a heap and tossed it from the window in disgust at my morbid imagination. Brr! And yet they say that a New York newspaper woman has no nerves. A voice hailed us from the darkness, and a white-gowned figure sprang out onto the walk. As the chauffeur brought the machine to a halt, Madeline Mack caught my hands. Her next two actions were thoroughly characteristic. Whirling to the driver, she demanded shortly, "How soon can you make the Grand Central Station?" The man hesitated. "Can you give me 20 minutes?" "Just. We will leave here at 1 sharp. You will wait, please." Having thus disposed of the chauffeur, Madeline never gave a thought to the matter of expense. She seized my arm and pushed me through the entrance of the Roanoke as nonchalantly as though we had parted 6 hours before instead of 6 weeks. "I hope you enjoyed Jamaica," I ventured. "Did you read the evening papers on the way over?" she returned as easily as though I had not spoken. "One," I answered shortly. Madeline's habit of ignoring my queries grated most uncomfortably at times. "Then you know what has been published concerning the case?" I nodded. "I imagine that you can add considerable." "As a matter of fact, I know less than the reporters." Madeline threw open the door of her room. "You have interviewed Senator Duffield on several occasions, have you not, Nora? You might say on several delicate occasions, if you cared to. You can tell me, then, whether the senator is in the habit of polishing his glasses when he is in a nervous mood." A rather superior smile flashed over my face. "I assure you that Senator Duffield never wears glasses on any occasion." Something like a chuckle came from Madeline. "Perhaps you can do as well on another question. You will observe in these newspapers 4 different photographs of the murdered secretary. Naturally, they bear many points of similarity. They were all taken in the last 3 years, but they contain one feature in common which puzzles me. Does it impress you in the same way?" I glanced at the group of photographs doubtfully. 3 of them were obviously newspaper snapshots, taken of the secretary while in the company of Senator Duffield. The 4th was a reproduction of a conventional cabinet photograph. They showed a clean-shaven, well-built young man of 30 or thereabouts, tall, and I should say inclined to athletics. I turned from the newspaper to Madeline with a shrug. "I'm afraid I don't quite follow you," I admitted ruefully. "There is nothing at all out of the ordinary in any of them that I can catch." Madeline carefully clipped the pictures and placed them under the front cover of her black morocco notebook. As she did so, a clock chimed the hour of 1. We both pushed back our chairs. As we stepped into the taxicab, Madeline tapped my arm. "I wonder if Raymond Rennick polished his glasses when he was nervous," she asked musingly. 3. Boston, from the viewpoint of the South Station, at 7:30 in the morning, suggested me a rheumatic individual climbing stiffly out of bed. Boston distinctly resents anything happening before noon. I'll wager that nearly every important event that she has contributed in history occurred after lunchtime. If Madeline Mack had expected to have to find her way to the Duffield home without a guide, she was pleasantly disappointed. No less a person than the senator himself was awaiting us at the train gate. A somewhat disheveled senator, it must be confessed, with the stubble of a day-old beard showing eloquently how his peace of mind and the routine of his habits had been shattered. As he shook hands with us, he made an obvious attempt to recover something of his ease of manner. "I trust that you had a pleasant night's rest," he ventured, as he led the way across the station to his automobile. "Much pleasanter than you had, I fear," replied Madeline. The senator sighed. "As a matter of fact, I found sleep hopeless. I spent most of the night with my cigar. The suggestion of meeting your train came as a really welcome relief." As we stepped into the waiting motor, a leather-lunged newsboy thrust a bundle of heavy-typed papers into our faces. The senator whirled with a curt dismissal on his tongue, when Madeline thrust a coin towards the lad and swept a handful of flapping papers into her lap. "There is absolutely nothing new in the case, Miss Mac, I assure you," the senator said impatiently. "The reporters have pestered me like so many leeches. The sight of the headlines makes me shiver." Madeline bent over her papers without comment. As I settled into the seat by her side, however, and the machine whirred around the corner, I saw that she was not even making a pretense of reading. I watched her with a frown as she turned the pages. There was no question of her interest, but it was not the type that held her attention. I doubted if she was perusing a line of the closely set columns. It was not until she reached the last paper that I solved the mystery. It was the illustrations that she was studying. When she finished the heap of papers, she began slowly and even more thoughtfully to go through them again. Now I saw that she was pondering the various photographs of Senator Duffield's family that the newspapers had published. I turned away from her bent form and tapping finger, but there was a magnetism of her abstraction that forced my eyes back to her in spite of myself. As my gaze returned to her, she thrust her gloved hand into the recesses of her bag and drew out her black morocco notebook. From its pages she selected the 4 newspaper pictures of the murdered secretary that she had offered me the night before. With a twinkle of satisfaction she grouped them about a large, black-bordered picture which stared up at her from the printed page in her lap. Our ride to the Duffield gate was not a long one. In fact, I was so absorbed by my furtive study of Madeline Mac that I was startled when the chauffeur slackened his speed, and I realized from a straightening of the senator's bent shoulders that we were nearing our destination. At the edge of the driveway, a quietly dressed man in a gray suit, who was strolling carelessly back and forth from the gate to the house, eyed us curiously as we passed, and touched his hat to the senator. I knew at once he was a detective. Trust a newspaper woman to spot a plain-clothes man, even if he has left his police uniform at home. Madeline did not look up, and the senator made no comment. As we stepped from the machine, a tall girl with severe, almost classical features and a profusion of nut-brown hair which fell away from her forehead without even the suggestion of a ripple, was awaiting us. "My daughter, Maria," Senator Duffield announced formally. Madeline stepped forward with extended hand. It was evident that Miss Duffield had intended only a brief nod. For an instant she hesitated, with a barely perceptible flush. Then her fingers dropped limply into Madeline Mac's palm. I chuckled inwardly at the ill grace with which she did it. "This must be a most trying occasion for you," Madeline said with a note of sympathy in her voice which made me stare. Effusiveness of any kind was so foreign to her nature that I frowned as we followed our host into the wide front drawing-room. As we entered by one door, a black-gowned, white-haired woman, evidently Mrs. Duffield, entered by the opposite door. In spite of the reserve of the society leader, whose sway might be said to extend to 3 cities, she darted an appealing glance at Madeline Mac that melted much of the newspaper cynicism with which I was prepared to greet her. Madeline crossed the room to her side and spoke a low sentence that I did not catch, as she took her hand. I found myself again wondering at her unwonted friendliness. She was obviously exerting herself to gain the good will of the Duffield household. Why? A trim maid, who stared at us as though we were museum freaks, conducted us to our rooms. adjoining apartments at the front of the third floor. The identity of Madeline Mac had already been noised through the house, and I caught a saucer-eyed glance from a second servant as we passed down the corridor. If the atmosphere of suppressed curiosity was embarrassing my companion, however, she gave no sign of the fact. Indeed, we had hardly time to remove our hats when the breakfast gong rang. The family was assembling in the old-fashioned dining-room when we entered. In addition to the members of the domestic circle whom I had already indicated, my attention was at once caught by two figures who entered just before us. One was a young woman whom it did not need a second glance to tell me was Beth Duffield. Her white face and swollen eyes were evidence enough of her overwrought condition, and I caught myself speculating why she had left her room. Her companion was a tall, slender young fellow with just the faintest trace of a stoop in his shoulders. As he turned towards us, I saw a handsome, though self-indulgent face, to a close observer suggesting evidences of more dissipation than was good for its owner. And, if the newspaper stories of the doings of Fletcher Duffield were true, the facial index was a true one. If I remembered rightly, Senator Duffield's son more than once had made prim old Boston town rub her spectacled eyes at the tales of his escapades. Fletcher Duffield bowed rather abstractedly as he was presented to us, but during the eggs and chops he brightened visibly, and put several curious questions to Madeline as to her methods of work, which enlivened what otherwise would have been a rather dull half-hour. As the strokes of 9 rang through the room, my companion pushed her chair back. "What time is the coroner's inquest, Senator?" Mr. Duffield raised his eyebrows at the change in her attitude. "It is scheduled for 11 o'clock." "And when do you expect Inspector Taylor of headquarters?" "In the course of an hour, I should say, perhaps less. His man, Martin, has been here since yesterday afternoon. You probably saw him as we drove into the yard. I can telephone Mr. Taylor if you wish to see him sooner." "That will hardly be necessary, thank you." Madeline walked across to the window. For a moment she stood peering out on the lawn. Then she stopped, and her hand fumbled with the catch. The window swung open with the noiselessness of well-oiled hinges, and she stepped out onto the veranda, without so much as a glance at the group about the table. I think the Senator and I rose from our chairs at the same instant. When we reached the window, Madeline was half across the lawn. Perhaps 20 yards ahead of her towered a huge maple rustling in the early morning breeze. I realized that this was the spot where Raymond Rennick had met his death. In spite of his nervousness, Senator Duffield did not forget his old-fashioned courtliness, which I believe had become second nature to him. Stepping aside with a slight bow, he held the window open for me, following at my shoulder. As we reached the lawn, I saw that the scene of the murder was in plain view from at least one of the principal rooms of the Duffield home. Madeline was leaning against the maple when we reached her. Senator Duffield said gravely, as he pointed to the gnarled trunk, "You are standing just at the point where the woman waited, Miss Mac." "Woman?" "I refer to the assassin," the Senator rejoined a trifle impatiently. "Judging by our fragmentary clues, she must have been hidden behind the trunk when poor Rennick appeared on the driveway. We found her slippers somewhat to the left of the tree, a matter of 8 or 10 feet, I should say." "Oh," said Madeline listlessly. I fancied that she was somewhat annoyed that we had followed her. "An odd clue, that slipper," the Senator continued with an obvious attempt to maintain the conversation. "If we were disposed to be fanciful, it might suggest the childhood legend of Cinderella." Madeline did not answer. She stood leaning back against the tree with her eyes wandering about the yard. Once I saw her gaze flash down the driveway to the open gate, where the detective, Martin, stood watching us furtively. "Nora," she said without turning, "will you kindly walk 6 steps to your right?" I knew better than to ask the reason for the request. With a shrug, I faced toward the house, and came to a pause at the end of the stipulated distance. "Is Miss Norriker standing where Mr. Rennick's body was found, Senator?" She will strike the exact spot, I think, if she takes 2 steps more." I had hardly obeyed the suggestion when I caught a swift rustle of skirts behind me. I whirled to see Madeline's lithe form darting towards me with the right hand raised, as though it held a weapon. "Good!" she cried. "I call you to witness, Senator, that I was fully 6 feet away when she turned. Now, I want you to take Miss Norriker's place. The instant you hear me behind you, the instant, mind you, I want you to let me know." She walked back to the tree, as the Senator reluctantly changed places with me. I could almost picture the murderess dashing upon her victim as Madeline bent forward. The Senator turned his back to us with a rather ludicrous air of bewilderment. My erratic friend had covered perhaps half of the distance between her and our host when he spun about with a cry of discovery. She paused with a long breath. "Thank you, Senator. What first attracted your attention to me?" "The rustle of your dress, of course." Madeline turned to me with the first smile of satisfaction I had seen since we entered the Duffield gate. "Was the same true in your case, Nora?" I nodded. The fact that you are a woman hopelessly betrayed you, if you had not been hampered by petticoats. Madeline broke in upon my sentence with that peculiar freedom which she always reserves to herself. "There are 2 things I would like to ask of you, Senator, if I may." "I am at your disposal, I assure you." "I would like to borrow a Boston directory and the services of a messenger." We walked slowly up the driveway, Madeline again relapsing into her preoccupied silence, and Senator Duffield making no effort to induce her to speak. End of Cinderella's Slippers by Hugh C. Ware, Part 1. Recording by Christine G. in Oslo, Norway. The 24th of September, 2012. Section 2 of the American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. Cinderella's Slippers by Hugh C. Ware. Part 2. 4. We had nearly reached the veranda when there was the sound of a motor at the gate, and a red touring car swept into the yard. An elderly, clean-shaven man in a long frock coat and a broad-brimmed felt hat was sharing the front seat with the chauffeur. He sprang to the ground with extended hand as our host stepped forward to greet him. The two exchanged half a dozen low sentences at the side of the machine, and then Senator Duffield raised his voice as they approached us. "Miss Mack, allow me to introduce my colleague, Senator Burrows." "I have heard of you, of course, Miss Mack," the Senator said genially, raising his broad-brimmed hat with a flourish. "I am very glad indeed that you are able to give us the benefit of your experience in this unfortunate affair. I presume that it is too early to ask if you have developed a theory?" "I wonder if you would allow me to reverse the question," Madeline responded as she took his hand. "I fear that my detective ability would hardly be of much service to you, Duffield?" Our host smiled faintly as he turned to repeat to a servant Madeline's request for a directory and a messenger. Senator Burrows folded his arms as his chauffeur circled on towards the garage. There was an odd suggestion of nervousness in the whole group. Or was it fancy? "Have you ever given particular study to the legal angle in your cases, Miss Mack?" The question came from Senator Burrows as we ascended the steps. "The legal angle? I'm afraid I don't grasp your meaning." The Senator's hand moved mechanically towards his cigar case. "I am a lawyer, and perhaps I argue unduly from a lawyer's viewpoint. We always work from the question of motive, Miss Mack. A professional detective, I believe, or at least the average professional detective, tries to find the criminal first and establish his motive afterwards." "Now, in a case such as this, Senator—" "In a case such as this, Miss Mack, the trained legal mind would delve first for the motive in Mr. Rennick's assassination. And your legal mind, Senator, I presume, has delved for the motive? Has it found it?" The Senator turned his unlighted cigar reflectively between his lips. "I have not found it. Eliminating the field of sordid passion and insanity, I divide the motives for the murderer under three heads: robbery, jealousy, and revenge. In the present case, I eliminate the first possibility at the outset, there remaining then only the two latter." "You are interesting. You forget, however, a fourth motive, the strongest spur to crime in the human mind." Senator Burrows took his cigar from his mouth. "I mean the motive of fear." Madeline said abruptly, as she swept into the house. When I followed her, Senator Burrows had walked over to the railing and stood staring down at the ground below. He had tossed his cigar away. In the room where we had breakfasted, one of the stable boys stood awkwardly awaiting Madeline Mack's orders, while John Dorrance, the valet, was just laying a city directory on the table. "Nora," she said as she turned to the boy, "will you kindly look up the list of packing houses? Pick out the largest and give me the address," she continued as I ran my fingers through the closely typed pages. With a growing curiosity, I selected a firm whose prestige was advertised in heavy letters. Madeline's fountain pen scratched a dozen lines across a sheet of her notebook, and she thrust it into an envelope and extended it to the stable lad. As the youth backed from the room, Senator Duffield appeared at the window. "I presume it will be possible for me to see Mr. Rennick's body, Senator?" Madeline Mack asked. Our host bowed. "Also, I would like to look at his clothes. The suit he was wearing at the time of his death, I mean. And, when I am through, I want 20 or 30 minutes alone in his room. If Mr. Taylor should arrive before I am through, will you kindly let me know?" "I can assure you, Miss Mack, that the police have been through Mr. Rennick's apartment with the microscope." "Then there can be no objection to my going through it with mine. By the way, Mr. Rennick's glasses, the pair that was found under his body, were packed with his clothes, were they not?" "Certainly," the Senator responded. I did not accompany Madeline into the darkened room where the corpse of the murdered man was reposing. To my surprise, she rejoined me in less than 5 minutes. "What did you find?" I queried as we ascended the stairs. "A 5-inch cut just above the 6th rib." "That is what the newspaper said." "You are mistaken. They said a 3-inch cut. Have you ever tried to plunge a dagger through 5 inches of human flesh?" "Certainly not." "I have." Accustomed as I was to Madeline Mack's eccentricities, I stood stock still and stared into her face. "Oh, I'm not a murderess. I refer to my dissecting room experiences." We had reached the upper hall when there was a quick movement at my shoulder, and I saw my companion's hand dart behind my waist. Before I could quite grasp the situation, she had caught my right arm in a grip of steel. For an instant I thought she was trying to force me back down the stairs. Then the force of her hold wrung a low cry of pain from my lips. She released me with a rueful apology. "Forgive me, Nora. For a woman, I pride myself that I have a strong wrist." "Yes, I think you have." "Perhaps now you can appreciate what I mean when I say that even I haven't the strength enough to inflict a wound that killed Raymond Rennick." "Then we must be dealing with an Amazon." "Would Cinderella's missing slipper fit an Amazon?" she answered dryly. As she finished her sentence we paused before a closed door, which I rightly surmised led into the room of the murdered secretary. Madeline's hand was on the knob when there was a step behind us, and Senator Duffield joined us with a rough bundle in his hands. "Mr. Rennick's clothes," he explained. Madeline nodded. "Inspector Taylor left them in my care to hold until the inquest." Madeline flung the door open without comment and led the way inside. Slipping the string from the bundle, she emptied the contents out onto the counterpane of the bed. They comprised the usual warm weather outfit of a well-dressed man, who evidently avoided the extremes of fashion, and she deftly sorted the articles into small, neat piles. She glanced up with an expression of impatience. "I thought you said they were here, Mr. Duffield." "What?" "Mr. Rennick's glasses. Where are they?" Senator Duffield fumbled in his pocket. "I beg your pardon, Miss Mac. I had overlooked them," he apologized, as he produced a thin paper parcel. Madeline carried it to the window and carefully unwrapped it. "You will find the spectacles rather badly damaged, I fear. One lens is completely ruined." Madeline placed the broken glasses on the sill, and raised the blind to its full height. Then she dropped to her knees and whipped out her microscope. When she arose, her small, black-clad figure was tense with suppressed excitement. A fat oak chiffonier stood in the corner nearest her. Crossing to its side, she rummaged among the articles that littered its surface, opened and closed the top drawer, and stepped back with an expression of annoyance. A writing table was the next point of her search, with results which I judged to be equally fruitless. She glanced uncertainly from the bed to the 3 chairs, the only other articles of furniture that the room contained. Then her eyes lighted again as they rested on the broad, carved mantel that spanned the empty fireplace. It held the usual collection of bric-a-brac of a bachelor's room. At the end farthest from us, however, there was a narrow red case, of which I caught only an indistinct view when Madeline's hand closed over it. She whirled towards us. "I must ask you to leave me alone now, please." The senator flushed at the peremptory command. I stepped into the hall, and he followed me, with a shrug. He was closing the door when Madeline raised her voice. "If Inspector Taylor is below, kindly send him up at once." "And what about the inquest, Miss Mac?" "There will be no inquest. To-day." Senator Duffield led the way downstairs, without a word. In the hall below, a ruddy-faced man, with gray hair, a thin gray beard and moustache, and a gray suit, suggesting any army officer in civilian clothes, was awaiting us. I could readily imagine that Inspector Taylor was something of a disciplinarian in the Boston Police Department. Also, relying on Madeline Mack's estimate, he was one of the 3 shrewdest detectives on the American continent. Senator Duffield hurried toward him with a suggestion of relief. "Miss Mack is upstairs, Inspector, and requested me to send you to her the moment you arrived." "Is she in Mr. Rennick's room?" The senator nodded. The inspector hesitated as though to ask another question, and then, as though thinking better of it, bowed and turned to the stairs. Inspector Taylor was one of those few policemen who had the honor of being numbered among Madeline Mack's personal friends, and I fancied that he welcomed the news of her arrival. Fletcher Duffield was chatting somewhat aimlessly with Senator Burrows as we sauntered out into the yard again. None of the ladies of the family were visible. The plain-clothes man was still lounging disconsolately in the vicinity of the gate. There was a sense of unrest in the scene, a vague expectancy. Although no one voiced the suggestion, we might all have been waiting to catch the first clap of distant thunder. As Senator Duffield joined the men, I wandered across to the dining-room window. I fancied the room was deserted, but I was mistaken. As I faced about toward the driveway, a low voice caught my ear from behind the curtains. "You are Miss Mack's friend, are you not? No, don't turn around, please." But I had already faced towards the open door. At my elbow was a white-capped maid, with her face almost as white as her cap, whom I remembered to have seen at breakfast. "Yes, I am Miss Mack's friend. What can I do for you?" "I have a message for her. Will you see that she gets it?" "Certainly." "Tell her that I was at the door of Senator Duffield's library the night before the murder." My face must have expressed my bewilderment. For an instant I fancied the girl was about to run from the room. I stepped through the window and put my arm about her shoulders. She smiled faintly. "I don't know much about the law, and evidence, and that sort of thing, and I'm afraid. You will take care of me, won't you?" "Of course I will, Anna. Your name is Anna, isn't it?" The girl was rapidly recovering her self-possession. "I thought you ought to know what happened Tuesday night. I was passing the door of the library. It was fairly late, about 10 o'clock, I think, when I heard a man's voice inside the room. It was a loud, angry voice, like that of a person in a quarrel. Then I heard a second voice, lower and much calmer." "Did you recognize the speaker?" They were Mr. Rennick and Senator Duffield." I caught my breath. "You said one of them was angry. Which was it?" "Oh, it was the senator. He was very much excited and worked up. Mr. Rennick seemed to be speaking very low." "What were they saying, Anna?" I tried to make my tones careless and indifferent, but they trembled in spite of myself. "I couldn't catch what Mr. Rennick said. The senator was saying some dreadful things. I remember he cried, 'You swindlers!' And then a bit later, 'I have evidence that should put you and your thieving crew behind the bars.' I think that is all. I was too bewildered to—" A stir on the lawn interrupted the sentence. Madeline Mack and Inspector Taylor had appeared. At the sound of their voices, the girl broke from my arm and darted toward the door. Through the window I heard the inspector's heavy tones, as he announced curtly, "I am telephoning the coroner, Senator, that we are not ready for the inquest today. We must postpone it until tomorrow." 5. The balance of the day passed without incidents. In fact, I found the subdued quiet of the Duffield home becoming irksome as evening fell. I saw little of Madeline Mack. She disappeared shortly after luncheon behind the door of her room, and I did not see her again until the dressing bell rang for dinner. Senator Duffield left for the city with Mr. Burrows at noon, and his car did not bring him back until dark. The women of the family remained in their apartments during the entire day, nor could I wonder at the fact. A morbid crowd of curious sightseers was massed about the gates almost constantly, and it was necessary to send a call for 2 additional policemen to keep them back. In spite of the vigilance, frequent groups of newspaper men managed to slip into the grounds, and, after half a dozen experiences in frantically dodging a battery of cameras, I decided to stick to the shelter of the house. It was a feeling of distinct relief that I heard the door of Madeline's room open and her voice calling to me to enter. I found her stretched on a lounge before the window, with a mass of pillows under her head. "Been asleep?" I asked. "No. To tell the truth, I've been too busy." "What? In this room?" "This is the first time I've been here since noon." "And where—" "Nora, don't ask questions." I turned away with a shrug that brought a laugh from the lounge. Madeline rose and shook out her skirts. I sat watching her as she walked across to the mirror and stood patting the great golden masses of her hair. A low tap on the door interrupted her. Dorrance, the valet, stood outside as she opened it, extending an envelope. Madeline fumbled it as she walked back. She let the envelope flutter to the floor, and I saw that it contained only a blank sheet of paper. She thrust it into her pocket without explanation. "How would you like a long motor ride, Nora?" "For business or pleasure?" "Pleasure. The day's work is finished. I don't know whether you agree with me or not, but I am strongly of the opinion that a whirl out under the elms of Cambridge, and then on to Concord and Lexington, would be delightful in the moonlight. What do you say?" The clock was hovering on the verge of midnight, and the household had retired when we returned. Madeline was in singularly cheery spirits. The low refrain which she was humming as the car swung into the grounds, Schubert's Serenade, I think it was, ceased only when we stepped onto the veranda and realized that we were entering the house of the dead. I turned off my lights in silence, and glanced undecidedly from the bed to the rocker by the window. The cool night breeze beckoned me to the latter, and I drew the chair back a pace and cuddled down among the cushions. The lawn was almost silver under the flood of moonlight, recalling vaguely the sweep of the ocean on a midsummer night. Back and forth along the edge of the gate the figure of a man was pacing like a tired sentinel. It was the plain-clothes officer from headquarters. His figure suggested a state of siege. He might have been surrounded by a skulking enemy. Or was the enemy within, and the sentinel stationed to prevent his escape? I stumbled across to the bed and to sleep, with the question echoing oddly through my brain. When I opened my eyes, the sun was throwing a yellow shaft of light across my bed, but it wasn't the sun that had awakened me. Madeline was standing in the doorway, dressed, with an expression on her face which brought me to my elbow. "What has happened now?" "Burglars." "Burglars?" I repeated dully. "I am going down to the library. Some one is making news for us fast, Nora. When will it be our turn?" I dressed in recording-breaking time, with my curiosity whetted by sounds of suppressed excitement which forced their way into the upper hall. The Duffield home not only was early astir, but was rudely jarred out of its customary routine. When I descended, I found a nervous group of servants clustered about the door of the library. They stood aside to let me pass, with attitudes of uneasiness which I surmised would mean a wholesale series of notices if the strange events in the usual well-regulated household continued. Behind the closed door of the library were Senator Duffield, his son Fletcher, and Madeline Mack. It was easy to appreciate at a glance the unusual condition of the room. At the right, one of the long windows, partly raised, showed the small, round hole of a diamond cutter just over the latch. It was obvious where the clandestine entrance and exit had been obtained. The most noticeable feature of the apartment, however, was a small square safe in the corner, with its heavy lid swinging awkwardly ajar, and the rug below littered with a heap of papers that had evidently been torn from its nearly tabulated series of drawers. The burglarious hands either had been very angry or very much in a hurry. Even a number of unsealed envelopes had been ripped across, as though the pillager had been too impatient to extract their contents in the ordinary manner. To a man of Senator Duffield's methodical habits, it was easy to imagine that the scene had been a severe wrench. Madeline was speaking in her quick, incisive tones as I entered. "Are you quite sure of that fact, Senator?" she asked sharply, as I closed the door and joined the trio. "Quite sure, Miss Mack." "Then nothing is missing. Absolutely nothing." "Not a single article, valuable or otherwise." "I presume, then, there were articles of more or less value in the safe?" "There were perhaps $400 in loose bills in my private cash drawer, and, so far as I know, there is not a dollar gone." "How about your papers and memoranda?" The Senator shook his head. "There was nothing of the slightest use to a stranger. As a matter of fact, just 2 days ago I took pains to destroy the only portfolio of valuable documents in the safe." Madeline stooped thoughtfully over the litter of papers on the rug. "You mean 3 evenings ago, don't you?" "How on earth, Miss Mack?" "You refer to the memoranda that you and Mr. Rennick were working on the night before his death, do you not?" "Of course. And then I saw Senator Duffield was staring at his curt questioner as though he had said something he hadn't meant to." "I think you told me once before that the combination of your safe was known only to yourself and Mr. Rennick." "You are correct." "Then, to your knowledge, you are the only living person who possesses this information at the present time?" "That is the case. It was a rather intricate combination, and we changed it hardly a month ago." Madeline rose from the safe, glanced reflectively at a huge leather chair, and sank into its depths with a sigh. "You say nothing has been stolen, Senator, that the burglar's visit yielded him nothing. For your peace of mind I would like to agree with you, but I am sorry to inform you that you are mistaken." "Surely, Miss Mack, you are hasty. I am confident that I have searched my possessions with the utmost care." "Nevertheless, you have been robbed." Senator Duffield glanced down at her small, lithe figure impatiently. "Then perhaps you will be good enough to tell me of what my loss consists." "I refer to the article for which your secretary was murdered. It was stolen from this room last night." Had the point of a dagger pressed against Senator Duffield's shoulder, he could not have bounded forward in greater consternation. His composure was shattered like a pane of glass crumbling. He sprang toward the safe with a cry like a man in sudden fear or agony. Jerking back its door, he plunged his hand into its lower left compartment. When he straightened, he held a long wax phonograph record. His dismay had vanished in a quick blending of relief and anger, as his eyes swept from the cylinder to the grave figure of Madeline Mack. "I fail to appreciate your joke, Miss Mack, if you call it a joke to frighten a man without cause as you have me." Have you examined the record in your hand, Senator?" Fletcher Duffield and I stared at the two. There was a suggestion of tragedy in the scene as the impatience and irritation gradually faded from the Senator's face. "It is a substitute," he groaned. "A substitute! I have been tricked, victimized, robbed!" He stood staring at the waxed record as though it were a heated iron burning into his flesh. Suddenly it slipped from his fingers and was shattered on the floor. But he did not appear to notice the fact as he burst out. "Do you realize that you are standing here inactive while the thief is escaping? I don't know how your wit surprised my secret, and I don't care now, but you are throwing away your chances of stopping the burglar while he may be putting miles between himself and us. Are you made of ice, woman? Can't you appreciate what this means? In the name of heaven, Miss Mac!" "The thief will not escape, Mr. Duffield." "It seems to me that he has already escaped." "Let me assure you, Senator, that your missing property is as secure as though it were locked in your safe at this moment." "But do you realize that, once a hint of its nature is known, it will be almost worthless to me?" "Better perhaps than you do. So well that I pledge myself to return it to your hands within the next half hour." Senator Duffield took 3 steps forward, until he stood so close to Madeline that he could have reached over and touched her on the shoulder. "I am an old man, Miss Mac, and the last 2 days have brought me almost to a collapse. If I have appeared unduly sharp I tender you my apologies. But do not give me false hopes. Tell me frankly that you cannot encourage me. It will be a kindness. You will realize that I cannot blame you." Senator Duffield's imperious attitude was so broken that I could hardly believe it possible that the same man who ruled a great political party almost by the swaying of his fingers was speaking. Madeline caught his hand with a grasp of assurance. "I will promise even more." She snapped open her watch. "If you return to this room at 9 o'clock, not only will I restore your stolen property, but I will deliver the murderer of Raymond Rennick." "Rennick's murderer!" the Senator gasped. Madeline bowed. "In this room at 9 o'clock." I think I was the first to move toward the door. Fletcher Duffield hesitated a moment, staring at Madeline. Then he turned and hurried past me down the hall. His father followed more slowly. As he closed the door I saw Madeline standing where we had left her, leaning back against her chair and staring at a woman's black slipper. It was the one which had been found by Raymond Rennick's dead body. I made my way mechanically toward the dining room, and was surprised to find that the members of the Duffield family were already at the table. With the exception of Madeline, it was the same breakfast group as the morning before. In another house, this attempt to maintain the conventions in the face of tragedy might have seemed incongruous, but it was so thoroughly in keeping with the self-contained Duffield character that, after the first shock, I realized it was not at all surprising. I fancy that we all breathed a sigh of relief, however, when the meal was over. We were rising from the table when a folded note, addressed to the Senator, was handed to the butler from the hall. He glanced through it hurriedly and held up his hand for us to wait. "This is from Miss Mac. She requests me to have all of the members of the family, and those servants who have furnished any evidence in connection with murder," the Senator winced as he spoke the word, "to assemble in the library at 9 o'clock. I think that we owe it both to ourselves and to her to obey her instructions to the letter. Perkins, will you kindly notify the servants?" As it happened, Madeline's audience in the library was increased by 2 spectators she had not named. The tooting of a motor sounded without, and the tall figure of Senator Burrows met us as we were leaving the dining room. Senator Duffield took his arm with a glance of relief and explained the situation as he forced him to accompany us. 6. In the library we found for the first time that Madeline was not alone. Engaged in a low conversation with her, which ceased as we entered, was Inspector Taylor. He had evidently been designated as the spokesman of the occasion. "Is everybody here?" he asked. "I think so," Senator Duffield replied. There are really only 5 of the servants who count in the case." Madeline's eyes flashed over the circle. "Close the door, please, Mr. Taylor. I think you had better lock it also." "There are 14 persons in this room," she continued, "counting, of course, Inspector Taylor, Miss Norriker, and myself. We may safely be said to be outside the case. There are then 11 persons here connected in some degree with the tragedy. It is in this list of 11 that I have searched for the murderer. I am happy to tell you that my search has been successful." Senator Duffield was the first to speak. "You mean to say, Miss Mac, that the murderer is in this room at the present time?" "Correct." "Then you accuse one of this group of dealing the blow which killed your secretary, and, later, of plundering your safe." Inspector Taylor moved quietly to a post between the 2 windows. Escape from the room was barred. I darted a stealthy glance around the circle in an effort to surprise a trace of guilt in the faces before me, and was startled to find my neighbors engaged in the same furtive occupation. Of the women of the family, the senator's wife had compressed her lips as though, as the mistress of the house, she felt the need of maintaining her composure in any situation. Maria was toying with her bracelet, while Beth made no effort to conceal her agitation. Senator Burrows was studying the pattern of the carpet with a face as inscrutable as a mask. Fletcher Duffield was sitting back in his chair, his hands in his pockets. His father was leaning against the locked room, his eyes flashing from face to face. With the exceptions of Dorrance, the valet, and Perkins, the butler, who I do not think would have been stirred out of their stolidness had the ceiling fallen, the servants were in an utter panic. 2 of the maids were plainly bordering on hysterics. Such was the group that faced Madeline in the Duffield library. One of the number was a murderer, whom the next 10 minutes were to brand as such. Which was it? Instinctively my eyes turned again toward the 3 women of the Duffield family, as Madeline walked across to a portière which screened a corner of the apartment. Jerking it aside, she showed, suspended from a hook in the ceiling, a quarter of fresh veal. On an adjoining stand was a long, thin-bladed knife, which might have been a dagger, ground to a razor edge. Madeline held it before her as she turned to us. "This is the weapon which killed Mr. Rennick." I fancied I heard a gasp as she spoke. Although I whirled almost on the instant, however, I could detect no signs of it in the faces behind me. "I propose to conduct a short experiment, which I assure you is absolutely necessary to my chain of reasoning," Madeline continued. "You may or may not know that the body of a calf practically offers the same degree of resistance to a knife as the body of a man. Dead flesh, of course, is harder and firmer than living flesh, but I think that, adding the thickness of clothes, we may take it for granted that the quarter of veal before us we have a fair substitute for the body of Raymond Rennick. Now watch me closely, please." Drawing back her arm, she plunged her knife into the meat with a force which sent it spinning on its hook. She drew the knife out and examined it reflectively. "I have made a cut of only a little more than 3½ inches. The blow which killed Mr. Rennick penetrated at least 5 inches. Here we encounter a singular striking feature of our case, involving a stratagem which I think I can safely say is the most unique in my experience. To all intents it was a woman who killed Mr. Rennick. In fact, it has been taken for granted that he met his death at the hand of a female assassin. We must dispose of this conclusion at the outset, for the simple reason that it was physically impossible for a woman to have dealt the death blow." I chanced to be gazing directly at Fletcher Duffield as Madeline made the statement. An expression of such relief flashed into his face that instinctively I turned about and followed the direction of his glance. His eyes were fixed on his sister, Beth. Madeline deposited a knife on the stand. "Indeed, I may say there are few men, perhaps not 1 in 10, with a wrist strong enough to have dealt Mr. Rennick's death blow," she went on. "There is only one such person among the 14 in this room at the present time. Again, you will recall that the wound was delivered from the rear, just as Mr. Rennick faced about in his own defense. Had he been attacked by a woman, he would have heard the rustle of her dress several feet before she possibly could have reached him. I think you will recall my demonstration of that fact yesterday morning, Mr. Duffield? Obviously, then, it is a man whom we must seek, if we would find the murderer of your secretary, and a man of certain peculiar characteristics. Two of these I can name now. He possessed a wrist developed to an extraordinary degree, and he owned feet as small and shapely as a woman's. Otherwise, the stratagem of wearing a woman's slippers and leaving one of them near the scene of the crime to divert suspicion from himself would never have occurred to him. Again I thought I heard a gasp behind me, but its owner escaped me a second time. There was a third marked feature among the physical characteristics of the murderer. He was near-sighted, so much so that it was necessary for him to wear glasses of the kind known technically as a double lens. Unfortunately for the assassin, when his victim fell, the latter caught the glasses in his hand, and they were broken under his body. The murderer may have been thrown into a panic, and feared to make the time to recover his spectacles, but it was a fatal blunder. Fortune, however, might have helped him even then in spite of this fact, for those who found the body fell into the natural error of considering the glasses to be the property of the murdered man. Had it not been for two minor details, this impression might never have been contradicted. Madeline held up a packet of newspaper illustrations. Several of them I recognized as the pictures of the murdered secretary that she had shown me at the Roanoke. The others were also photographs of the same man. If Mr. Rennick hadn't been fond of having his picture taken, the fact that he never wore glasses on the street might not have been noticed. None of his pictures, not even the snapshots, showed a man in spectacles. It is true that he possessed a pair, and it is here where those who discovered the crime went astray. But they were for reading purposes only, the kind termed a .125 lens, while those of his assailant were a .210 lens. The clinch of the matter, I later found Mr. Rennick's own spectacles in his room, where he had left them the evening before. Madeline held up the red leather case she had found on the mantelpiece, and tapped it musingly as she gave a slight nod to Inspector Taylor. We have now the following description of the murderer: a slenderly built man, with an unusual wrist, possibly an athlete at one time, who possesses a foot capable of squeezing into a woman's shoe, and who is handicapped by near-sightedness. Is there an individual in this room to whom this description applies?" There was a new glitter in Madeline's eyes as she continued. "Through the co-operation of Inspector Taylor, I am enabled to answer this question. Mr. Taylor has traced the glasses of the assassin to the optician who gave the prescription for them. I am not surprised to find that the owner of the spectacles tallies with the owner of these other interesting articles." With the words, she whisked from the stand at her elbow the long, narrow-bladed dagger and a pair of soiled black suede slippers. There was a suggestion of grotesque unreality about it all. It was much as though I had been viewing the denouement of a play from the snug vantage point of an orchestra seat, waiting for the lights to flare up and the curtain to ring down. A shriek ran through my ears, jarring me back to the realization that I was not a spectator, but a part of the play. A figure darted toward the window. It was John Dorrance, the valet. The next instant Inspector Taylor threw himself on the fleeing man's shoulders, and the two went to the floor. "Can you manage him?" Madeline called. "Unless he prefers cold steel through his body to cold steel about his wrist," was the rejoinder. "I think you may dismiss the other servants, Senator," Madeline said. "I wish, however, that the family would remain a few moments." As the door closed again, she continued: "I promised you also, Senator, the return of your stolen property. I have the honor to make that promise good." From her stand, which was rapidly assuming the proportions of a conjurer's table, she produced a round, brown paper parcel. "Before I unwrap this, have I your permission to explain its contents?" "As you will, Miss Mac." Perhaps the most puzzling feature of the tragedy is the motive. It is this parcel which supplies us with the answer. Your secretary, Mr. Duffield, was an exceptional young man. Not only did he repeatedly resist bribery such as comes to few men, but he gave his life for his trust. At any time since this parcel came into his possession he could have sold it for a fortune. Because he refused to sell it, he was murdered for it. Perhaps every reader of the newspapers is more or less familiar with Senator Duffield's investigations of the ravages of a certain great trust. A few days ago the senator came into possession of evidence against the combine of such a drastic nature that he realized it would mean nothing less than the annihilation of the monopoly, imprisonment for the chief officers, and a business sensation such as this country has seldom known. Once the officers of the trust knew of this evidence, however, they would be forearmed in such a manner that its value would be largely destroyed. The evidence was a remarkable piece of detective work. It consisted of a phonographic record of a secret directors' meeting, laying bare the inmost depredations of the corporation. Madeline paused as the handcuffed valet showed signs of a renewed struggle. Inspector Taylor without comment calmly snapped a second pair of bracelets about his feet. The trust was shrewd enough to appreciate the value of a spy in the Duffield home. Dorrance was engaged for the post, and from what I have learned of his character he filled it admirably. How he stumbled on Senator Duffield's latest coup is immaterial. The main point is that he tried to bribe Mr. Rennick so persistently to betray his post that the latter threatened to expose him. Partly in the fear that he would carry out his threat, and partly in the hope that he carried memoranda which might lead to the discovery of the evidence that he sought, Dorrance planned and carried out the murder. In the secretary's pocket he discovered the combination of the safe, and made use of it last night. I found the stolen phonograph record this morning behind the register of the furnace pipe in Dorrance's room. I had already found that this was his cachet, containing the dagger which killed Rennick and the second of Cinderella's slippers. The pair was stolen some days ago from the room of Miss Beth Duffield. The swirl of the day was finally over. Dorrance had been led to his cell. The coroner's jury had returned its verdict, and all that was mortal of Raymond Rennick had been laid in its last resting place. Madeline and I had settled ourselves in the homeward bound Pullman as it rumbled out of the Boston station in the early dusk. "There are two questions I want to ask," I said reflectively. Madeline looked up from her newspaper with a yawn. "Why did John Dorrance bring you back a blank sheet of paper when you dispatched him on your errand? As a matter of fact, there was nothing else for him to bring back. Mr. Taylor kept him at police headquarters long enough to give me time to carry my search through his room. The message was a blind." "And what was the quarrel that the servant girl, Anna, heard in the Duffield library?" "It wasn't a quarrel, my dear girl. It was the senator preparing the speech with which he intended to launch his evidence against the trust. The senator is in the habit of dictating his speeches to a phonograph. Some of them, I am afraid, are rather fiery." End of Cinderella's Slippers by Hugh C. Ware, Part 2. Recording by Christine G. in Oslo, Norway. The 6th of October, 2012.
Section 3 of the American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, The Nameless Man, by Rodriguez Ottolenghi. Mr. Barnes was sitting in his private room with nothing of special importance to occupy his thoughts, when his office boy announced a visitor. "What name?" asked Mr. Barnes. "None," was the reply. "You mean," said the detective, "that the man did not give you his name? He must have one, of course. Show him in." A minute later the stranger entered, and bowing courteously began the conversation at once. "Mr. Barnes, the famous detective, I believe?" said he. "My name is Barnes," replied the detective. "May I have the pleasure of knowing yours?" "I sincerely hope so," continued the stranger. "The fact is, I suppose I have forgotten it." "Forgotten your name?" Mr. Barnes scented an interesting case. and became doubly attentive. "Yes," said the visitor, "that is precisely my singular predicament. I seem to have lost my identity. That is the object of my call. I wish you to discover who I am. As I am evidently a full-grown man, I can certainly claim that I have a past history, but to me that past is entirely blank. I awoke this morning in this condition, yet apparently in possession of all my faculties, so much so that I at once saw the advisability of consulting a first-class detective, and upon inquiry I was directed to you. Your case is most interesting from my point of view. I mean, to you, of course, it must seem unfortunate, yet it is not unparalleled. There have been many such cases recorded, and for your temporary relief I may say that, sooner or later, complete restoration of memory usually occurs. But now let us try to unravel your mystery as soon as possible, that you may suffer as little inconvenience as there need be. I would like to ask you a few questions." "As many as you like. I will do my best to answer." "Do you think that you are a New Yorker?" "I have not the least idea whether I am or not." "You say you were advised to consult me. By whom?" "The clerk at the Waldorf Hotel, where I slept last night." "Then of course he gave you my address. Did you find it necessary to ask him how to find my offices?" "Well, no, I did not." "That seems strange, does it not? I certainly had no difficulty in coming here. I suppose that must be a significant fact, Mr. Barnes." "It tends to show that you have been familiar with New York. But we must still find out whether you live here or not. How did you register at the hotel?" "M. J. G. Remington, City." "You are quite sure that Remington is not your name?" "Quite sure. After breakfast this morning I was passing through the lobby when the clerk called me twice by that name. Finally, one of the hall boys touched me on the shoulder and explained that I was wanted at the desk. I was very much confused to find myself called Mr. Remington, a name which certainly is not my own. Before I fully realized my position, I said to the clerk, 'Why do you call me Remington?' And he replied, 'Because you registered under that name.' I tried to pass it off, but I'm sure that the clerk looks upon me as a suspicious character." "What baggage have you with you at the hotel?" "None, not even a satchel." "May there not be something in your pockets that would help us? Letters, for example?" "I am sorry to say that I've made a search in that direction, but found nothing. Luckily I did have a pocketbook, though." "Much money in it?" "In the neighborhood of $500. Mr. Barnes turned to his table and made a few notes on a pad of paper. While so engaged, his visitor took out a fine gold watch, and after a glance at the face, was about to return it to his pocket, when Mr. Barnes wheeled around in his chair and said, "That's a handsome watch you have there, of a curious pattern, too. I'm rather interested in old watches." The stranger seemed confused for an instant, and quickly put up his watch, saying, "There's nothing remarkable about it, merely an old family relic. I value it more for that than anything else. But about my case, Mr. Barnes, how long do you think it will take to restore my identity to me? It's rather awkward to go about under a false name." "I should think so," said the detective. "I will do my best for you, but you've given me absolutely no clue to work upon, so that it's impossible to say what my success will be. Still, I think 48 hours should suffice. At least in that time I ought to have made some discoveries for you. Suppose you call me again on the day after tomorrow at noon precisely. Will that suit you?" "Very well indeed. If you can tell me who I am at that time, I shall be more than convinced that you are a great detective, as I have been told." He arose and prepared to go, and upon the instant Mr. Barnes touched a button under his table with his foot, which caused a bell to ring in a distant part of the building, no sound of which penetrated the private office. Thus anyone could visit Mr. Barnes in his den, and might leave unsuspicious of the fact that a spy would be awaiting him out on the street, who would shadow him persistently day and night until recalled by his chief. After giving the signal, Mr. Barnes held his strange visitor in conversation a few minutes longer, to allow his spy opportunity to get to his post. "How will you pass the time away, Mr. Remington?" said he. "We may as well call you by that name until I find your true one." "Yes, I suppose so. As to what I shall be doing during the next 48 hours, why, I think I may as well devote myself to seeing the sights. It is a remarkably pleasant day for a stroll, and I think I will visit your beautiful Central Park." "A capital idea. By all means I would advise occupation of that kind. It would be best not to do any business until your memory is restored to you." "Business? Why, of course I can do no business." "No, if you were to order any goods, for example, under the name of Remington. Later on, when you resume your proper identity, you might be arrested as an impostor." "By George, I had not thought of that. My position is more serious than I had realized. I thank you for the warning. Sightseeing will assuredly be my safest plan for the next 2 days." "I think so. Call at the time agreed upon, and hope for the best. If I should need you before then, I will send to your hotel." Then, saying good morning, Mr. Barnes turned to his desk again, and as the stranger looked at him before stepping out of the room, the detective seemed engrossed with some papers before him. Yet scarcely had the door closed upon the retreating form of his recent visitor when Mr. Barnes looked up with an air of expectancy, and a moment later a very tiny bell in a drawer of his desk rang, indicating that the man had left the building, the signal having been sent to him by one of his employees, whose business it was to watch all departures and notify his chief. A few moments later Mr. Barnes himself emerged, clad in an entirely different suit of clothing, and with such alteration in the color of his hair that more than a casual glance would have been required to recognize him. When he reached the street, the stranger was nowhere in sight, but Mr. Barnes went to a doorway opposite, and there he found written in blue pencil the word "Up," whereupon he walked rapidly uptown as far as the next corner, where once more he examined a doorpost upon which he found the word "Right," which indicated the way the men ahead of him had turned. Beyond this he could expect no signals, for the spy shadowing the stranger did not know positively that his chief would take part in the game. The 2 signals which he had written on the doors were merely a part of a routine, and intended to aid Mr. Barnes should he follow. But if he did so, he would be expected to be in sight of the spy by the time the second signal was reached, and so it proved in this instance. For as Mr. Barnes turned the corner to the right, he easily discerned his man about 2 blocks ahead, and presently was near enough to see Remington also. The pursuit continued until Mr. Barnes was surprised to see him enter the park, thus carrying out his intention as stated in his interview with the detective. Entering at the Fifth Avenue gate, he made his way towards the menagerie, and here a curious incident occurred. The stranger had mingled with the crowd in the monkey house, and was enjoying the antics of the mischievous little animals, when Mr. Barnes, getting close behind him, deftly removed a pocket handkerchief from the tail of his coat, and swiftly transferred it to his own. On the day following, shortly before noon, Mr. Barnes walked quickly into the reading room of the Fifth Avenue Hotel. In one corner there is a handsome mahogany cabinet containing 3 compartments, each of which is entered through double doors, having glass panels in the upper half. About these panels are draped yellow silk curtains, and in the center of each appears a white porcelain numeral. These compartments are used as public telephone stations, the applicant being shut in so as to be free from the noise of the outer room. Mr. Barnes spoke to the girl in charge, and then passed into the compartment numbered 2. Less than 5 minutes later, Mr. Leroy Mitchell came into the reading room. His keen eyes peered about him, scanning the countenances of those busy with the papers or writing. And then he gave the telephone girl a number, and went into the compartment numbered 1. About 10 minutes elapsed before Mr. Mitchell came out again, and having paid the toll, he left the hotel. When Mr. Barnes emerged, there was an expression of extreme satisfaction upon his face. Without lingering, he also went out, but instead of following Mr. Mitchell through the main lobby to Broadway, he crossed the reading room and reached 23rd Street through the side door. Thence he proceeded to the station of the elevated railroad and went uptown. 20 minutes later He was ringing the bell of Mr. Mitchell's residence. The Buttons, who answered his summons, informed him that his master was not at home. "He usually comes in to luncheon, however, does he not?" asked the detective. "Yes, sir," responded the boy. "Is Mrs. Mitchell at home?" "No, sir." "Miss Rose?" "Yes, sir." "Ah, then I'll wait. Take my card to her." Mr. Barnes passed into the luxurious drawing room, and was soon joined by Rose, Mr. Mitchell's adopted daughter. "I am sorry papa is not at home, Mr. Barnes," said the little lady, "but he will surely be in to luncheon if you will wait." "Yes, thank you, I think I will. It is quite a trip up, and being here I may as well wait a while and see your father, though the matter is not of any great importance." "Some interesting case, Mr. Barnes? If so, do tell me about it. You know I am almost as interested in your cases as papa is." "Yes, I know you are, and my vanity is flattered. But I am sorry to say that I have nothing on hand at present worth relating. My errand is a very simple one. Your father was saying a few days ago that he was thinking of buying a bicycle, and yesterday by accident I came across a machine of an entirely new make, which seems to me superior to anything yet produced. I thought he might be interested to see it before deciding what kind to buy." "I'm afraid you're too late, Mr. Barnes. Papa had bought a bicycle already." "Indeed? What style did he choose?" "I really do not know, but it is down in the lower hall if you care to look at it." "It is hardly worth while, Miss Rose. After all, I have no interest in the new model, and if your father has found something that he likes, I won't even mention the other to him. It might only make him regret his bargain. Still, on second thoughts, I will go down with you, if you'll take me into the dining room and show me the head of that moose which your father has been bragging about killing. I believe it has come back from the taxidermist's." "Oh, yes, he is just a monster. Come on." They went down to the dining room, and Mr. Barnes expressed great admiration for the moose's head, and praised Mr. Mitchell's skill as a marksman. But he had taken a moment to scrutinize the bicycle which stood in the hallway, while Rose was opening the blinds in the dining room. Then they returned to the drawing room, and after a little more conversation Mr. Barnes departed, saying that he could not wait any longer, but he charged Rose to tell her father that he particularly desired him to call at noon on the following day. Promptly, at the time appointed, Remington walked into the office of Mr. Barnes and was announced. The detective was in his private room. Mr. Leroy Mitchell had been admitted but a few moments before. "Ask Mr. Remington in," said Mr. Barnes to his boy, and when that gentleman entered, before he could show surprise at finding a third party present, the detective said, "Mr. Mitchell, this is the gentleman whom I wish you to meet. Permit me to introduce you to Mr. Mortimer J. Goldie, better known to the sporting fraternity as G. J. Mortimer, the champion short-distance bicycle rider who recently rode a mile in the phenomenal time of 1.36 on a 3-lap track." As Mr. Barnes spoke, he gazed from one to the other of his companions with a half-quizzical and wholly pleased expression on his face. Mr. Mitchell appeared much interested, but the newcomer was evidently greatly astonished. He looked blankly at Mr. Barnes a moment, then dropped into a chair with the query, "How in the name of conscience did you find that out?" "That much was not very difficult," replied the detective. "I can tell you much more. Indeed, I can supply your whole past history, provided your memory has been sufficiently restored for you to recognize my facts as true." Mr. Barnes looked at Mr. Mitchell and winked one eye in a most suggestive manner, at which that gentleman burst into hearty laughter, finally saying, "We may as well admit that we are beaten, Goldie. Mr. Barnes has been too much for us." "But I want to know how he has done it," persisted Mr. Goldie. "I have no doubt that Mr. Barnes will gratify you. Indeed, I am as curious as you are to know by what means he has arrived at his quick solution of the problem which we set for him." "I will enlighten you as to detective methods with pleasure," said Mr. Barnes. "Let me begin with a visit made to me by this gentleman 2 days ago. At the very outset his statement aroused my suspicion, though I did my best not to let him think so. He announced to me that he had lost his identity, and I promptly told him that his case was not uncommon. I said that in order that he might feel sure that I did not doubt his tale. But truly, his case, if he was telling the truth, was absolutely unique. Men have lost recollection of their past, and even have forgotten their names, but I have never before heard of a man who had forgotten his name and at the same time knew that he had done so. "A capital point, Mr. Barnes," said Mr. Mitchell. "You were certainly shrewd to suspect fraud so early." "Well, I cannot say that I suspected fraud so soon, but the story was so improbable that I could not believe it immediately. I therefore was what I might call analytically attentive during the rest of the interview. The next point worth noting which came out was that, although he had forgotten himself, he had not forgotten New York, for he admitted having come to me without special guidance." "I remember that," interrupted Mr. Goldy, "and I think I even said to you at the moment that it was significant. And I told you that it at least showed that you had been familiar with New York. And this was better proven when you said that you would spend the day at Central Park, and when, after leaving here, you had no difficulty in finding your way thither. Do you mean to say that you had me followed? I made sure that no one was after me." "Well, yes, you were followed," said Mr. Barnes with a smile. "I had a spy after you, and I followed you as far as the park myself. But let me come to the other points in your interview and my deductions. You told me that you had registered as Mr. M.J.G. Remington. This helped me considerably, as we shall see presently. A few minutes later you took out your watch, and in that little mirror over my desk, which I use occasionally when I turn my back upon a visitor, I noted that there was an inscription on the outside of the case. I turned and asked you something about the watch, when you hastily returned it to your pocket with the remark that it was an old family relic. Now, can you explain how you could have known that, supposing that you had forgotten who you were?" "Neatly caught, Goldy," laughed Mr. Mitchell. "You certainly made a mess of it there." "It was an asinine slip," said Mr. Goldy, laughing also. "Now then," continued Mr. Barnes, "you readily see that I had good reason for believing that you had not forgotten your name. On the contrary, I was positive that your name was a part of the inscription on the watch. What, then, could be your purpose in pretending otherwise?" "I did not discover that for some time. However, I decided to go ahead and find you out if I could. Next, I noted two things. Your coat opened once, so that I saw pinned to your vest a bicycle badge, which I recognized as the emblem of the League of American Wheelmen." "Oh," cried Mr. Mitchell, "shame on you, Goldy, for a blunderer." "I had entirely forgotten the badge," said Mr. Goldy. "I also observed," the detective went on, "little indentations on the sole of your shoe, as you had your legs crossed, which satisfied me that you were a rider even before I observed the badge. Now then we come to the name and the significance thereof. Had you really lost your memory, the choosing of a name when you registered at the hotel would have been a haphazard matter of no importance to me. But as soon as I decided that you were imposing upon me, I knew that your choice of a name had been a deliberate act of mind, one from which deductions could be drawn." "Ah, now we come to the interesting part," said Mr. Mitchell. "I love to follow a detective when he uses his brains. The name as registered, and I examined the registry to make sure, was odd. 3 initials are unusual. A man without a memory, and therefore not quite sound mentally, would hardly have chosen so many. Then why had it been done in this instance? What more natural than that these initials represented the true name? In assuming an alias, it is the most common method to transpose the real name in some way. At least it was a good working hypothesis. Then the last name might be very significant. Remington. The Remingtons make guns, sewing machines, typewriters, and bicycles. Now this man was a bicycle rider, I was sure. If he chose his own initials as a part of the alias, it was possible that he selected Remington because it was familiar to him. I even imagined that he might be an agent for Remington bicycles, and I had arrived at that point during our interview, when I advised him not to buy anything until his identity was restored. But I was sure of my quarry when I stole a handkerchief from him at the park and found the initials M.J.G. upon the same." "Marked linen on your person!" exclaimed Mr. Mitchell. "Worse and worse. We'll never make a successful criminal of you, Goldy." "Perhaps not. I shan't cry over it." I felt sure of my success by this time," continued Mr. Barnes. "Yet at the very next step I was balked. I looked over a list of L.A.W. members, and could not find a name to fit my initials, which shows, as you will see presently, that, as I may say, too many clues spoil the broth. Without the handkerchief I would have done better. Next I secured a catalogue of the Remingtons, which gave a list of their authorized agents, and again I failed. Returning to my office, I received information from my spy, sent in by messenger, which promised to open a way for me. He had followed you about, Mr. Goldie, and I must say you played your part very well, so far as avoiding acquaintances is concerned. But at last you went to a public telephone and called up someone. My man saw the importance of discovering to whom you had spoken, and bribed the telephone attendant to give him the information. All that he learned, however, was that you had spoken to the public station at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. My spy thought that this was inconsequent, but it proved to be at once that there was collusion, and that your man must have been at the other station by previous appointment. As that was at noon, a few minutes before the same hour on the following day, that is to say, yesterday, I went to the Fifth Avenue Hotel telephone and secreted myself in the middle compartment, hoping to hear what your partner might say to you. I failed in this, as the boxes are too well made to permit sound to pass from one to the other. But imagine my gratification to see Mr. Mitchell himself go into the box. "And why?" asked Mr. Mitchell. "Why, as soon as I saw you, I comprehended the whole scheme. It was you who had concocted the little diversion to test my ability. Thus, at last, I understood the reason for the pretended loss of identity. With the knowledge that you were in it, I was more than ever determined to get at the facts. Knowing that you were out, I hastened to your house, hoping for a chat with little Miss Rose, as the most likely member of your family to get information from." "Oh, fie, Mr. Barnes," said Mr. Mitchell, "to play upon the innocence of childhood. I am ashamed of you." "All's fair, etc. Well, I succeeded. I found Mr. Goldie's bicycle in your hallway, and, as I suspected, it was a Remington. I took the number and hurried down to the agency, where I readily discovered the wheel number 5086 is ridden by G.J. Mortimer, one of their regular racing team. I also learned that Mortimer's private name is Mortimer J. Goldie. I was much pleased at this, because it showed how good my reasoning had been about the alias, for you observe that the racing name is merely a transposition of the family name. The watch, of course, is a prize, and the inscription would have proved that you were imposing upon me, Mr. Goldie, had you permitted me to see it. Of course, that was why I put it back in my pocket. I said just now," said Mr. Barnes, "that without the stolen handkerchief I would have done better. Having it, when I looked over the L.A.W. list, I went through the G's only. Without it I should have looked through the G's, J's, and M's, not knowing how the letters may have been transposed. In that case I should have found G.J. Mortimer, and the initials would have proved that I was on the right track." "You have done well, Mr. Barnes," said Mr. Mitchell. "I asked Goldie to play the part of a nameless man for a few days, to have some fun with you. But you've had fun with us, it seems, though I am conceited enough to say that had it been possible for me to play the principal part, you would not have pierced my identity so soon." "Oh, I don't know," said Mr. Barnes. "We are both of us a little egotistical, I fear." "Undoubtedly. Still, if I ever set another trap for you, I will assign myself the chief rôle." "Nothing would please me better," said Mr. Barnes. "But, gentlemen, as you have lost in this little game, it seems to me that someone owes me a dinner at least." "I'll stand the expense with pleasure," said Mr. Mitchell. "Not at all," interrupted Mr. Goldie. "It was through my blundering that we lost, and I'll pay the piper." "Settle it between you," cried Mr. Barnes. "But let us walk on. I am getting hungry." Whereupon they adjourned to Delmonico's. End of The Nameless Man, by Rodriguez Ottolenghi. Section 4 of The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, The Montezuma Emerald, by Rodriguez Ottolenghi. "Is the inspector in?" Mr. Barnes immediately recognized the voice and turned to greet the speaker. The man was Leroy Mitchell's English valet. Contrary to all precedent and tradition, he did not speak in Cockney dialect, not even stumbling over the proper distribution of the letter H throughout his vocabulary. That he was English, however, was apparent to the ear, because of a certain rather attractive accent, peculiar to his native island, and to the eye because of a deferential politeness of manner, too seldom observed in American servants. He also always called Mr. Barnes Inspector, oblivious of the fact that he was not a member of the regular police, and mindful only of the English application of the word to detectives. "Step right in, Williams," said Mr. Barnes. "What is the trouble?" "I don't rightly know, Inspector," said Williams. "Won't you let me speak to you alone? It's about the master." "Certainly. Come into my private room." He led the way, and Williams followed, remaining standing, although Mr. Barnes waved his hand towards a chair as he seated himself in his usual place at his desk. "Now then," continued the detective, "what's wrong? Nothing serious, I hope?" "I hope not, indeed, sir. But the master's disappeared." "Disappeared, has he?" Mr. Barnes smiled slightly. "Now, Williams, what do you mean by that? You didn't see him vanish, eh?" "No, sir, of course not. If you'll excuse my presumption, Inspector, I don't think this is a joke, sir, and you're laughing." "All right, Williams," answered Mr. Barnes, assuming a more serious tone. "I will give your tale my sober consideration. Proceed." "Well, I hardly know where to begin, Inspector, but I'll just give you the facts without any unnecessary opinions of my own." Williams rather prided himself upon his ability to tell what he called a straight story. He placed his hat on a chair, and standing behind it, with one foot resting on a rung, checked off the points of his narrative as he made them by tapping the palm of one hand with the index finger of the other. "To begin, then," said he, "Mrs. Mitchell and Miss Rose sailed for England Wednesday morning of last week. That same night, quite unexpected, the master says to me, says he, 'Williams, I think you have a young woman you're sweet on down at Newport.' 'Well, sir,' says I do know a person as answers that description, though I must say to you, Inspector, that how he ever came to know it beats me. But that's aside, and digression is not my habit. Well, Williams,' the master went on, 'I shan't need you for the rest of this week, and if you'd like to take a trip to the seashore, I shan't mind standing the expense and letting you go.' Of course I thanked him very much, and I went, promising to be back on Monday morning as directed. And I kept my word, Inspector, though it was a hard wrench to leave the young person last Sunday in time to catch the boat, the moon being bright and everything most propitious for a stroll, it being her Sunday off and all that. But as I said, I kept my word, and was up to the house Monday morning only a little after 7, the boat having got in at 6. I was a little surprised to find that the master was not at home, but then it struck me as how he must have gone out of town over Sunday, and I looked for him to be in for dinner. But he did not come to dinner, nor at all that night. Still, I did not worry about it. It was the master's privilege to stay away as long as he liked, only I could not help thinking I might just as well have had that stroll in the moonlight Sunday night. But when all Tuesday and Tuesday night went by, and no word from the master, I must confess that I got uneasy. And now here it's Wednesday noon and no news, so I just took the liberty to come down and ask your opinion in the matter, seeing as how you are a particular friend of the family, and an inspector to boot." "Really, Williams," said Mr. Barnes, "all I see in your story is that Mr. Mitchell, contemplating a little trip off somewhere with friends, let you go away. He expected to be back by Monday, but, enjoying himself, has remained longer. I hope that's all, sir, and I've tried to think so, but this morning I made a few investigations of my own, and I'm bound to say what I've found don't fit that theory." "Ah, you have some more facts. What are they?" "One of them is this cablegram that I found only this morning under a book on the table in the library." He handed a blue paper to Mr. Barnes, who took it and read the following on a cable blank: "Emerald. Danger. Await letter." For the first time during the interview Mr. Barnes' face assumed a really serious expression. He studied the dispatch silently for a full minute, and then, without raising his eyes, said, "What else?" "Well, Inspector, I don't know that this has anything to do with the affair, but the master had a curious sort of jacket made of steel links, so tight and so closely put together that I've often wondered what it was for. Once I made so bold as to ask him, and he said he, 'Williams, if I had an enemy, it would be a good idea to wear that, because it would stop a bullet or a knife.' And then he laughed and went on, 'Of course, I shan't need it for myself. I bought it when I was abroad once, merely as a curiosity. Now, Inspector, that jacket's disappeared also." "Are you quite sure?" "I've looked from dining room to garret for it. The master's derringer is missing too. It's a mighty small affair, could be held in the hand without being noticed, but it carries a nasty looking ball." "Very well, Williams, there may be something in your story. I'll look into the matter at once. Meanwhile, go home and stay there, so that I may find you if I want you." "Yes, sir. I thank you for taking it up. It takes a load off my mind to know you're in charge, Inspector. If there's harm come to the master, I'm sure you'll track the party down. Good morning, sir." "Good morning, Williams." After the departure of Williams, the detective sat still for several minutes, lost in thought. He was weighing two ideas. He seemed still to hear the words which Mr. Mitchell had uttered after his success in unraveling the mystery of Mr. Goldy's lost identity. "Next time I will assign myself the chief role," or words to that effect, Mr. Mitchell had said. Was this disappearance a new riddle for Mr. Barnes to solve? If so, of course he would undertake it as a sort of challenge which his professional pride could not reject. On the other hand, the cable dispatch and the missing coat of mail might portend ominously. The detective felt that Mr. Mitchell was somewhat in the position of the fabled boy who cried "wolf" so often that when at last the wolf really appeared, no assistance was sent to him. Only Mr. Barnes decided that he must chase the wolf, whether it be real or imaginary. He wished, though, that he knew which. 10 minutes later he decided upon a course of action, and proceeded to a telegraph office, where he found that, as he had supposed, the dispatch had come from the Paris firm of jewelers from which Mr. Mitchell had frequently bought gems. He sent a lengthy message to them, asking for an immediate reply. While waiting for the answer, the detective was not inactive. He went direct to Mr. Mitchell's house, and once more questioned the valet, from whom he obtained an accurate description of the clothes which his master must have worn, only one suit being absent. This fact alone seemed significantly against the theory of a visit to friends out of town. Next, Mr. Barnes interviewed the neighbors, none of whom remembered to have seen Mr. Mitchell during the week. At the 6th house below, however, he learned something definite. Here he found Mr. Mordaunt, a personal acquaintance and member of one of Mr. Mitchell's clubs. This gentleman stated that he had dined at the club with Mr. Mitchell on the previous Thursday, and had accompanied him home in the neighborhood of 11 o'clock, parting with him at the door of his own residence. Since then he had neither seen nor heard from him. This proved that Mr. Mitchell was at home one day after Williams went to Newport. Leaving the house, Mr. Barnes called at the nearest telegraph office and asked whether a messenger summons had reached them during the week from Mr. Mitchell's house. The record slip showed that the last call had been received at 12:30 a.m. on Friday. A cab had been demanded and was sent, reaching the house at 1 o'clock. At the stables, Mr. Barnes questioned the cab driver and learned that Mr. Mitchell had alighted at Madison Square. "But he got right into another cab," added the driver. "It was just a chance I seen him, 'cause he made as if he was going into the Fifth Avenue, but luck was agin 'em, for I'd scarcely gone 2 blocks back when I had to get down to fix my harness, and while I was doing that, who should I see but my fare go by in another cab." "You did not happen to know the driver of that vehicle?" suggested Mr. Barnes. "That's just what I did happen to know. He's always by the square, along the curb by the park. His name's Jerry. You'll find him easy enough, and he'll tell you where he took that fly bird." Mr. Barnes went downtown again, and did find Jerry, who remembered driving a man at that stated time as far as the Imperial Hotel, but beyond that the detective learned nothing, for at the hotel no one knew Mr. Mitchell, and none recollected his arrival early Friday morning. From the fact that Mr. Mitchell had changed cabs and doubled on his track, Mr. Barnes concluded that he was after all merely hiding away for the pleasure of baffling him, and he felt much relieved to divest the case of its alarming aspect. However, he was not long permitted to hold this opinion. At the telegraph office he found a cable dispatch awaiting him, which read as follows: "Montezuma Emerald forwarded Mitchell the 10th. Previous owner murdered, London 11th. Mexican suspected, warned Mitchell." This assuredly looked very serious. Casting aside all thought of a practical joke, Mr. Barnes now threw himself heart and soul into the task of finding Mitchell, dead or alive. From the telegraph office he hastened to the custom house, where he learned that an emerald, the invoiced value of which was no less than $20,000, had been delivered to Mr. Mitchell in person upon payment of the custom duties at noon of the previous Thursday. Mr. Barnes, with this knowledge, thought he knew why Mr. Mitchell had been careful to have a friend accompany him to his home on that night. But why had he gone out again? Perhaps he felt safer at a hotel than at home, and having reached the Imperial, taking 2 cabs to mystify the villain who might be tracking him, he might have registered under an alias. What a fool he had been not to examine the registry, as he could certainly recognize Mr. Mitchell's handwriting, though the name signed would of course be a false one. Back, therefore, he hastened to the Imperial, where, however, his search for familiar chirography was fruitless. Then an idea occurred to him. Mr. Mitchell was so shrewd that it would not be unlikely that, meditating a disappearance to baffle the men on his track, he had registered at the hotel several days prior to his permanently stopping there. Turning the page over, Mr. Barnes still failed to find what he sought, but a curious name caught his eye: Miguel Palma, City of Mexico. Could this be the London murderer? Was this the suspected Mexican? Well, if so, here was a bold and therefore dangerous criminal who openly put up at one of the most prominent hostelries. Mr. Barnes was turning this over in his mind when a diminutive newsboy rushed into the corridor shouting, "Extra, son! Extra, son! All about the horrible murder! Extra!" Mr. Barnes purchased the paper and was stupefied at the headlines: "Robert Leroy Mitchell drowned. His body found floating in the East River. A dagger in his back. Indicates murder." Mr. Barnes rushed out of the hotel, and quickly finding a cab, instructed the man to drive rapidly to the morgue. On the way he read the details of the crime as recounted in the newspaper. From this he gathered that the body had been discovered early in the morning by 2 boatmen, who towed it to shore and handed it over to the police. An examination at the morgue had established the identity by letters found on the corpse, and the initials marked on the clothing. Mr. Barnes was sad at heart, and inwardly fretted because his friend had not asked his aid when in danger. Jumping from the cab, almost before it had fully stopped in front of the morgue, he stumbled and nearly fell over a decrepit-looking beggar, upon whose breast was a printed card soliciting alms for the blind. Mr. Barnes dropped a coin, a silver quarter, into his outstretched palm, and hurried into the building. As he did so, he was jostled by a tall man who was coming out, and who seemed to have lost his temper. As he muttered an imprecation under his breath in Spanish, as the detective's keen ear noted the foreign tongue, An idea occurred to him which made him turn and follow the stranger. When he reached the street again, he received a double surprise. The stranger had already signaled the cab which Mr. Barnes had just left, and was entering it, so that he had only a moment in which to observe him. Then the door was slammed, and the driver whipped up his horses and drove rapidly away. At the same moment the blind beggar jumped up and ran in the direction taken by the cab. Mr. Barnes watched them both till both cab and beggar disappeared around the next corner, and then he went into the building again, deeply thinking over the episode. He found the morgue keeper and was taken to the corpse. He recognized the clothing at once, both from the description given by Williams and because he now remembered to have seen Mr. Mitchell so dressed. It was evident that the body had been in the water for several days, and the marks of violence plainly pointed to murder. Still sticking in the back was a curious dagger of foreign make, the handle projecting between the shoulders. The blow must have been a powerful stroke, for the blade was so tightly wedged in the bones of the spine that it resisted ordinary efforts to withdraw it. Moreover, the condition of the head showed that a crime had been committed, for the skull and face had been beaten into a pulpy mass with some heavy instrument. Mr. Barnes turned away from the sickening sight to examine the letters found upon the corpse. One of these bore the Paris postmark, and he was allowed to read it. It was from the jeweler's, and was the letter alluded to in the warning cable. Its contents were: Dear Sir, as we have previously advised you, the Montezuma emerald was shipped to you on the 10th instant. On the following day, the man from whom we had bought it was found dead in Dover Street, London, killed by a dagger thrust between the shoulders. The meagre accounts telegraphed to the paper here state that there is no clue to the assassin. We were struck by the name, and remembered that the deceased had urged us to buy the emerald, because, as he declared, he feared that a man had followed him from Mexico, intending to murder him to get possession of it. Within an hour of reading the newspaper story, a gentlemanly-looking man, giving the name of Miguel Palma, entered our store and asked if we had purchased the Montezuma emerald. We replied negatively, and he smiled and left. We notified the police, but they have not yet been able to find this man. We deemed it our duty to warn you, and did so by cable. The signature was that of the firm from which Mr. Barnes had received the cable in the morning. The plot seemed plain enough now. After a fruitless murder of the man in London, the Mexican had traced the emerald to Mr. Mitchell, and had followed it across the water. Had he succeeded in obtaining it? Among the things found on the corpse was an empty jewel case bearing the name of the Paris firm. It seemed from this that the gem had been stolen. But if so, this man, Miguel Palma, must be made to explain his knowledge of the affair. Once more visiting the Imperial, Mr. Barnes made inquiry, and was told that Mr. Palmer had left the hotel on the night of the previous Thursday, which was just a few hours before Mr. Mitchell had undoubtedly reached there alive. Could it be that the man at the morgue